Hey, boys and girls, I would like to introduce to you good friends of mine, Wendell and Florence Miner. They live here in Washington, and they illustrate and write books. Okay, give me your best attention.
Hey, how are you? Third grade through fifth grade, right?
Yep.
I bet everybody's reading chapter books from third grade on up, right? Yeah. So, even though we do picture books, I want to say something about picture books. A lot of times I'm told that, once you get to third grade, you don't want to be seen carrying a picture book because it makes you look like you're younger than you think you are. But that's okay. Picture books have a lot of information in them, and the picture books that we try to do, Florence and myself, are books that bring you lots of information. I've done a book on Buzz Aldrin. If you have never, and then when you're in fifth grade, you'll be studying the Revolutionary War, and you're so lucky to live in Washington, Connecticut, that has so much Revolutionary War history. And one of my favorite books, story of Amelia Earhart's very successful first flight across the Atlantic, which is a very exciting book. And Buzz Aldrin's biography. Now, did I ever think when I was your age I'd grow up to become friends with a man who walked on the moon? Books can take you places you could never, ever imagine. And then we did this book. This was Buzz's idea. He wanted to do 500 years of space exploration history in 40 pages. Now, if you think that's easy, I got something to tell you. It's not. But this is all about his take on the history. We have Galileo and Isaac Newton. We have the history of first flight. We can talk about that. And believe it or not, this is young Neil Armstrong before he ever became an astronaut. And probably most of you don't know that Neil Armstrong set lots of altitude speed records in a rocket plane called the X-15, which would go all the way up to about 63 miles up along to the curvature of the Earth. And Neil Armstrong was the first Apollo astronaut to pass away 2 years ago. Buzz Aldrin turned 84 this year. This is the 45th anniversary of the first moon landing this July 20th. And Mike Collins is still with us as well. But all these astronauts who were pioneers in space are all getting older, and they're leaving us one by one, which is the way time passes. But one of the books that I thought I'd talk to you about today early on is let's see, where did I put that for us? The Last Train book. Is that around here?
It'd be in there.
Mr. Absent-Minded. Anyway, we'll find it. Here it is. Books happen in many different strange ways. Now, I have a friend named Gordon Titcomb who's a musician, and he plays the banjo, the mandolin, the guitar. He's very talented. He's played with Arlo Guthrie and lots of famous musicians. Well, he wrote this book called The Last Train, and he played the song for me several years ago, and he had just written it. And I said, you know what, Gordon? I think that's a book. I think we can make a book out of your song. And what we just started to discuss is the fact that Washington, Connecticut, you're in Washington Depot. Why is it called Washington Depot? Did you know a train used to stop here?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah, because it ran through Green Valley.
Right. And New Milford, we can we bring the lights down? Thank you.
Oh, God.
It's all right. Anyway, does anybody recognize that station? Where is it? It's the New Milford train station, when the train used to come in. There it is. Now, I grew up in a town called Aurora, Illinois, and Aurora, Illinois is the birthplace of the Burlington Railroad. And just about everybody in town worked for the railroad. We had a giant roundhouse in my town where the engines used to come to be repaired. This is the Torrington station that was eventually torn down. So we had lots of beautiful railroad stations in this state. This is a train that's coming through the Aurora station long before I was born. but I remember some of the last age of steam trains. This is what we call the original roundhouse, and this was a giant building that had a big carousel, and the trains would come in and they could turn and go different directions on different tracks. And this was the main hub of the Midwest. And that's one of the big engines that came into the roundhouse back in the 1950s. Beautiful old engines. That's the rail yard in my town that no longer is that busy anymore. And Burlington Railroad was a very, very innovative railroad. They invented the first diesel electric. And in the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago, the exposition, this train was like the first, this was so advanced for its age, it was like riding on a rocket. This train set a land speed record of over 90 miles an hour. And it ran from 1934 until the early 1960s. Now, I'm old enough to remember taking a ride on this when I was a kid. And there shows you the difference in the two engines from the old to the new at that time. And of course, this is the train you probably are most familiar with. You know, the Burlington, this diesel engine is very well known, and you still see some of them in service. Well, the last train became our project, and I had to bring this to life visually. How do you do that? Well, the one thing that we have in this state is a wonderful museum, the Essex Steam Train Museum. Has anybody ever taken a ride on the Essex Steam Train down there? A few of you had. So what we did, when I do my research, there's Gordon and his banjo, and here we are over with engine number 40. And what was really fun is that the museum let Gordon and I have the train for a whole afternoon. They gave us an engineer and a fireman, and we had the biggest Lionel train you could ever hope for. And there is the engineer that we worked with that day. And there is number 40. And so I took lots of photographs. And we even went out to this big pasture where he would back it up so I could get really good photographs of it and do my photo research. Beautiful engine restored. What's interesting about it is that I got to ride in the cab, and I wanted to do that ever since I was probably 4 years old. So it was really a thrill to be inside of one of these and things. And when I got into the cab, the engineer says, "Welcome to the first time you've ever sat behind a controlled explosion." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, you know, if this thing ever steam builds up, we could blow sky high. So you have to sign a release before you get on board." So he said, "Well, don't worry, we know what we're doing." But those gauges are what the fireman has to monitor, and then there is an emergency release valve that lets emergency steam roll. But to see how this engine lives and breathes, it has its own personality, it was really an amazing experience. And there's Paul behind the controls. And of course, the man who does all the work is the fireman, who has to feed the boiler. And there's an automatic door there. And the heat in there in the summertime is really amazing. And there he is throwing shovels of coal into the boiler. And there we are underway. And there is the fireman and assistant fireman and the engineer. It was quite a day. Well, after I do all my research, you saw that photograph of Paul in the cab, I do rough drawings. And at this point, we were calling it the train, but we wound up calling it the last train. And there you have my painting after I had taken my reference photographs. These are just preliminary sketches that my editor sees. And what eventually this wound up being is a story of 3 generations of a train family. There's a little railroad station in the center of our town. The windows boarded up and the roof is falling down. And if you'll notice, that train station says Aurora. That's my hometown. That was an old train station that was long abandoned and torn down. If you close your eyes and listen, you can almost hear the sound of those big iron horses rolling into town. if you remember that photograph I took before, this is my version of the ghost train, you can see right through it. My grandfather was a railroad man. He drove the trains around. My daddy, he sold tickets till they closed the station down. And there's my sketch, there's my reference, and my painting on the right. Now the tracks that shone like silver have turned a rusty brown. 30 years ago, the last train rode through town. I'm writing on the city of New Orleans, thinking about the Wabash Cannonball. City of New Orleans was a famous train that a song was written about, and the Wabash Cannonball was another famous train. And what I did was I illustrated the last of the city of New Orleans cars that was Illinois Central ran, and they had this wonderful brown and orange and yellow color scheme that I liked. Ooh, midnight flyer, hear that lonesome freight train whistle call. Old cigar box filled with memories, my boyhood souvenirs, the watch my daddy gave me when he quit in 20 years. And there we have a cigar box filled with memories and this old pocket watch. Now the flattened copper pennies look like little metal tears that a railroad cries before it disappears. Now, when I was a kid, we used to do this. I don't know if anybody ever does. Does anybody put a penny in a railroad track?
My dad used to.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun. They don't like that too much anymore, but it was fun. A ticket punch that clipped a million snowflakes every year. The faded Union Dude cards of a railroad engineer, and there are some of the memorabilia from railroads past. One of my favorites is the little sleeping cat called Chessie from the Chesapeake Bay and Ohio lines. Every item, one more chapter in a story we hold dear in a history of a railroad man's career. The brakeman with his oil can, the porter dressed in white, the fireman with his shovel full of jet black anthracite. Are gone now like dreams that slowly vanished in the night, just memories of that once familiar sight. And I posed for the guy in the back. I figured I had to put myself in the book too. And it's all talking about electric, the changing times, and jet planes taking over. And the memories this boy has of his family and his the watch that was passed down from 3 generations of train families. So that kind of gives you an idea of really how I work on a book. And I'm going to show you right now lots of different stuff that I've done, and just for fun. This is I Love to Read Month. And that is a book that Florence is working on called How to Be a Bigger Bunny for little kids. And so I decided to make a poster. And tomorrow is International Polar Bear Day. Does anybody know that? You do now. Now, we all have to start somewhere. This is where I started as a young artist. This was my first grade drawing of a 500-pound robin. My mother thankfully saved a lot of these early drawings, which I'm glad I have today, because I think it's always nice to know where you start and where you wind up. I used to like to draw anything that moves, whether it was a boat or a plane or a truck or a car. And here's the ranch house I was going to live in when I grew up to be a cowboy. And there's the first pilgrim couple. Can you tell that? Well, what's interesting is that all the stuff I drew when I was in grade school are things I'm still interested in today. I love animals. I do lots of drawings of animals from all different kinds of books. This is called A Book from Morning, Noon, and Night. painting. Twin pigs from my book Heartland. Margaret Wise Brown, who wrote how many of you grew up with Goodnight Moon? Just about everybody. This is Margaret Wise Brown, and I got to re-illustrate some of her poems later, long after she passed away. But let me tell you a little story about Goodnight Moon. When it was first published as a book, it wasn't very popular. It hardly sold any copies. But it stuck around, and then, when the kids first grew up, this book was published in 1947, I believe it is. And then 20 years later, when the kids grew up with that book, got a little older, and when they got into their 20s and 30s, they decided, I want to share that book with my child that I grew up with. And that's how that book started. Do you know that book sells 1 million copies a year now? It is one of the great classics. And so it shows you that things start slowly and build. But this is a book about beautiful poems. And the animals that I love to paint. Makes you think of spring, doesn't it? There. Here comes a bunny, the first to stray, out of April into May. And here comes a robin, the first to fly, out of June and into July. And if we're lucky enough, we'll see that again. Bunnies jump and bunnies run. Bunnies also sit in the sun. This is the song of the bunnies. Very simple poetry for very little children, and I'm sure you have experienced that when you were much, much younger. I was once asked to illustrate, there's a children's book organization called Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and their logo is a kite, and every month they ask an illustrator to take the theme of a kite and illustrate it. And I thought, well, if a mouse was going to go flying a kite, wouldn't it be a cheese kite? I think so. This is from the book called Cat, What Is That? And Tony Johnson is a good friend of mine. We're working on our next 2 books together. And this is our cat, Cinder. And she became a star. Our veterinarian wrote a book on cats. And they decided they'd use her for the model, so I took that photograph. And then Sophie, she spends a lot of time with us as well. And don't you love the way she crosses her paws? This is from Cat, What Is That? It is the hope, it is the eyes lit with green fire after the prize. It is the old weaver of string beneath the stars. It is the thing. Very interesting poetry about the end. Up on the sail, smiling at things. It is the no. It is the sphinx. It is the frisk. It is the loon, leaping beneath a whiskered moon. So next time you look at the moon, look again. This is the cover for Morning, Noon, and Night. And believe it or not, one night the cats were in the bedroom window, looking straight out, and I thought they looked very excited. And I looked back, and this little baby raccoon had his paws up on the windowsill looking back at the cats. And I said, one of these days I'm going to paint that, and I did. This is about the wolves coming back to Yellowstone.
Oh, I know. I remember that story.
Yeah.
The wolves coming back to Yellowstone.
And one of my favorite birds, the snowy owl. And a lot of them have been sighted down here this year, all the way down from Alaska and Canada. Snow Bear is about Bessie and Snow Bear. In Barrow, Alaska, sometimes polar bears are abandoned by their mothers, and they are saved by the village of Barrow, Alaska. Now, in my research to do a painting, the parka that Bessie is wearing is an authentic Inupiat parka that Jean George had borrowed from a native up there. This parka was worth $5,000, so I was I didn't want to have it in my house too long. It was too expensive to have around. But isn't that a beautiful piece of costuming. Baby elephant seal. Everglades alligator. Bart Simpson the pumpkin. This is from Pumpkinheads. You can know this book. Now here's how do you get an idea for a book? And Florence, this is Florence's first book. And we talked about when you're an artist, first of all, let's go back to reading. 26 letters of the alphabet compose all the language of the world. When you're an artist, 3 colors, red, yellow, and blue, and 3 shapes comprise the way you look at the world. The circle, the square, and the triangle. So what about taking a triangle, because we look at the shape of a Christmas tree, it really is a triangle, and take that idea and see how many ideas we can use the triangle with. A tree so small that it would fit in the wall, or a tree that was made just for a city parade, or one just for dogs. There are all kinds of interesting things in the book. And then when we did our book on penguins, we got to actually perform with Elvis the penguin. Elvis the penguin. And this is Florence's book about, we did about 10 of the 17 species of penguins. Believe it or not, I worked on this book before Happy Feet. I think all penguins kind of look like Happy Feet.
Yeah, all babies.
You could fly underwater or sing a duet. You could live on the land but get really wet. You could wear a tuxedo or make funny faces. Or go for a swim in warm or cold places. You could live underground or on top of the ice. Penguin pals all around make it twice as nice. You could have funny names like Chinstrap in Gen 2. You could learn to toboggan, woo-hoo! You could wear fancy feathers in dry or wet weather. Or how about squids and fishes without any dishes? But here's a surprise for me and you. Penguins do lots of things that you can do too. Well, here's the book, The Last Polar Bear. This is the cover. And we talked about this book in the other class about this young Eskimo boy, Tiglet, who actually meets up with a mother polar bear who is asking him to follow her to a place where there's an abandoned polar bear. This is a book called The Buffalo Are Back with Gene George. It's all about the story of the buffalo in the Great Plains. And then Farm Friends is something that I enjoy doing because when I was a little boy, both of my parents grew up on farms, and I remember fondly visiting all the animals on the farm. And this book, see, this is yours truly. Remember, I had hair then too. But I had a name for all my chickens, and I was really very close to rural life. And this is all about the different animals that you meet on the farm. You got it. If you remember Cindercat, that's Cindercat posing. Now this, you may think this is fantasy, but it's true. My dad said when he grew up in the dairy farm, they used to have these old bathtubs where the cows would come drink. But if he was working out in the fields and he wanted to cool off on a hot summer day, he'd jump in the bathtub. And he said a lot of times the cows didn't care, they just come and drink water out of the bathtub when he was in it anyway. So I never forgot that story, so I decided, well, why not? what I like about what I do is I have so much fun, I never really feel like I'm working. So remember that, if you find something you love to do, you'll never work a day in your life. Now, I brought this book in too, and this is all about the Magic Pumpkin Seed Company. We grow really big pumpkins. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a big thing now in this country where they grow giant pumpkins. And 2 years ago, the world record was 2,009 pounds, over 1 ton. Can you imagine that? They didn't break the record last year. Nobody came even close, but I don't know how somebody could get a pumpkin that big. But it's all about the whole idea of, if Paul Bunyan gave you some magic pumpkin seeds, how big could your pumpkin grow? Well, maybe one that can hide behind the Capitol Dome. Or go to the hot air balloons fair. Or be president, maybe. Or one that sees the moon rocket blast off. Or I call this the pumpkin hurl. Now, this book isn't even published yet, and I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about, I do a lot of books on the environment. And there have been a lot of stories on YouTube in the last couple of years about rescued dolphins. I watched one the other night where a diver was diving and with some friends, and a dolphin swam up to the diver and asked for help. He had had some fishing line caught in his fin and through his mouth, and the dolphin patiently waited for the diver to cut all the line away and then swam away. Now, there was an incident in Baja, California a few years ago where some people were out on a boat and they saw a humpback whale that had been caught up in nets. And this happens a lot. The big fishing nets, the illegal shark nets that are used, the crab pot nets and so forth. These big animals can get caught, and sometimes they don't make it. They get tangled up and they can't live. This is the story about Valentina that we thought was interesting, but there's so many of these stories, we decided to do the story of what happens when a whale is rescued. And there are now environmental teams that go out and try to do this professionally. It is something that you're not supposed to do. It's if you don't know what you're doing. It can be very, very dangerous with these giant creatures. But this is a story about the rescue of one humpback whale. And I had to do a lot of research on getting these paintings correct. But to show you the size, the relative size of these creatures. And they are remarkably intelligent and sensitive to their environment. And in this particular case, we start out with the whale, and there's a fishing boat, and there are many of them that cast their nets. And oftentimes the technology of what we do to catch fish and the environmental world of the whale collide, and not in such a good way. But I had a lot of fun painting these pictures. And this story talks a lot about the different migrations of the whale from the Arctic all the way down to California. If you look it up online, you can see all the migration routes of some of these whales. It's pretty remarkable. Their breeding grounds versus where they travel during the year. And Florence and I went on a whale watch up in Cape Cod, and we went out and watched these giant animals come up to the boat, and what they do is what they call breaching, and they'll jump out of the water. And, people are, just, it's such an exciting thing. Has anybody ever done that, been out on a whale watch? It's really a lot of fun to do. So anyway, you see a fishing boat in the nets, and all of a sudden you realize before long, this whale gets caught up in a giant fishing net. And he thrashes and thrashes and tries to get loose, but to no avail, to no good reason. So it's at a point where the whale is really in trouble. And lo and behold, a rescue team is called and they're sent out, and they usually go out in teams of pairs of, they work in pairs, so they're usually about 4 on a mission like this. And what they do is they try to calm the whale, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But this whale was aware enough to know that the whale was being helped. And so they work diligently getting all the guidelines and the webbing away from the whale. And when the whale is free, something very wonderful happens, and that is the whale comes up and greets the divers and thanks them, as if to thank them. And at the end, the whale makes its final breach. You see the divers in the background cheering, and ultimately the whale is free. So it's a really nice story. And in the end of this book, we have lots of facts and websites to visit, which we always like to try to do. This is Jean Craighead George. Jean died 2 years ago, just before her 93rd birthday. And I worked with Jean for 22 years. We did 18 books together. And here's where we are, out in Kearney, Nebraska. Every year in March, 500,000 sandhill cranes descend on the Platte River. Now, you have to get up before dawn, you go to these blinds, and you watch these cranes. These cranes have been doing this for literally millions of years. They're the oldest living descendants to the dinosaur. And they even sound almost like dinosaurs when they start croaking in the morning. We also did a book on the wolves coming back to Yellowstone. We visited Yellowstone National Park, the Lamar River Valley. Has anybody read this yet? Julie the Wolves. It's one of Jean's great books. It's a Newbery Award-winning book. The Eagles are back. Since you are the Eagles here, you might be interested in knowing how successful the Eagles coming back from almost complete extinction 50 years ago. And now there are eagles everywhere, including rivers along in our wonderful state. And the buffalo are back. Do you know, what I found out that was really interesting is that once there were 75 million buffalo in this country, almost from coast to coast. Within about 70 years, they were almost all eliminated, killed off. And Teddy Roosevelt decided that he'd try to save them, and they found a existing herd of buffalo up in the Montana hills. There were about 300 to 400 of them. In those 300 to 400 buffalo that they found back in Teddy Roosevelt's time are the parents of all the 250,000 buffaloes we see today. It's an amazing story. It's all about how the prairie were plowed up, and it's a very worthwhile reading. How about My Son of the Mountain? Has anybody read that? You all should read that. That's about Sam Gribley, who runs away from home and lives on the side of a mountain in the Catskills, and he raises a peregrine falcon and lives in a tree for a year by himself. It's a great survival story. It's been in print for over a half a century. It's sold like 12 million copies. It's a very famous book. There was a movie made of it. And this is a book that if you're in fourth, fifth grade, a very interesting book. Nat Philbrick wrote a book called In the Heart of the Sea, and this is the young adult version of that. And has anybody heard of the book Moby Dick, the very famous book? Well, there was a whaler called the Essex out of Nantucket, who, on one of its whaling expeditions back in the late, or in the 1840s, was rammed by a sperm whale and sunk. And the surviving sailors that were on the whaleboats had a 4-month ordeal in surviving it in the open sea. It's a really interesting story. But the author, Herman Melville, read about this real-life real-life incident, and that's where Moby Dick was written, from the real-life experience. And of course, I've done fantasy stuff too. I don't know, Rebecca Rupp, if you've ever read The Dragon of Lonely Island, there's a couple of these are really, really interesting books. Well, there we have the slide presentation, so I think we've got some time to talk and answer questions. So why don't we turn the lights up? So what do you think, kids? All right? Yes. What kind of book is my favorite? What am I working on? I have a book coming out on the giant sequoia tree, and I have a book coming out, a biography of the famous painter Edward Hopper. And the whale book is coming out next year, and I'm working on, what else am I working on for us? I'm working on about, I have a picture book biography of the man who wrote Call of the Wild, Jack London. And as a matter of fact, I think for you fifth graders, I did my own edition of Call of the Wild. Matter of fact, may I borrow that for a second? Now, I want to tell you this story simply because I think your teachers would be interested in mine. I had a sixth grade teacher, and you'll be going, your fifth graders, looking forward to sixth grade, who would read to our class every day for 15 minutes. And because I'm a dyslexic and I had a hard time learning how to read and learning to test, I could never make the words make sense to me. But Mr. Gilkey, who would read every day, he would read Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe, or he'd read a Mark Twain story, or Jack London's Call of the Wild. And I remember these pictures in my mind when I was in sixth grade. Well, many, many decades later, I'm called to re-illustrate my favorite story of Jack London, Call of the Wild. And I dedicated this book to Mr. Gilkey. And let's see if I can find my introduction here, because I think you'll find it interesting. Let's see. Where I thought it was in here. Anyway, Mr. Gilkey made such an impression on me that I dedicated all of the pictures in this book to my sixth grade teacher. And I think the good teachers that you have who help you learn how to read and test better are very, very important. And you'll never forget, I'll never forget all of my teachers up to sixth grade. After that, it gets a little fuzzy. But you'll always remember first through sixth grade. And those are the most important teachers, I think, of your whole school career, because they make such a difference. If you're going to be studying in fifth grade, have you studied the Revolution yet?
Yeah.
Fourth grade.
Fourth grade, okay, good. This is a book that is an interesting point of departure, because each one of these old inn signs that I hand painted and hand lettered is about a person, a place, or an event in the Revolutionary War period. And what's interesting is that Cogswell Tavern at the bottom of Baldwin Hill is where Colonel Cogswell had what we call a public house where you could stay during the Revolutionary War. You'd get a meal there, whatever. And he was part of Washington's officer corps in Connecticut. So the history of the Revolutionary War is right here where we live. If you go up to the old Judea Cemetery, there are 75 Revolutionary War heroes buried there. And a lot of the town names and roads that you see are named after some Revolutionary War families here. Yes? Here you go. So down at the bottom, there's a sign outside, and it dedicates Cogswell Tavern, named the Daughters of the American Revolution. All of these books I'm leaving in the library, so if you want to look them up. One of my favorite stories is about Amelia Earhart. And everybody thinks about Amelia Earhart disappearing in 1937, right? Does anybody know about her very successful transatlantic flight that was in 1932? Now what's interesting is that she took off 5 years to the day that Lindbergh did his famous transatlantic flight in 1927. And what's also interesting is that she had very little time to prepare for this flight, but the research that goes into this kind of book is very time consuming, but what's interesting is I did a map in the back here. This was 2,026 miles, and the flight took 14 hours and 56 minutes. Now what's interesting is you think, okay, what's so big about that? Amelia Earhart didn't have a radio. She lost her compass. She lost her airspeed indicator. She didn't know how high she was. She had a bad weather report. She flew into an ice storm, tried to get out of it. Her plane iced up. She went straight down 3,000 feet just above the ocean, pulled it up just in time, and flew by dead reckoning, what we call, she just flew by guesswork until she got to the coast of Ireland. There was no automatic pilot, no heated cabin. She had 1 can of tomato juice with her. And she had to hold that stick in place for 14 hours and 56 minutes straight. And she had no choice. She said, well, she had a raft with her, but the ocean was so cold and so rough, she never would have survived. She came so close to not making it. It is truly amazing that she did. Now, the airplane that she was flying was the state of the art in her day, and there are only about 132 of these planes made. There are only 4 that exist today, and they're all in museums. I found one in Florida where I got to visit and see how big it is, and how the cockpit looked and so forth and so on. But this is something, Eileen, does anybody know who Eileen Collins is?
She's a good book writer.
No? Anybody else? That's Jackie Collins, right? Eileen Collins was the first woman to pilot and command the shuttle. Now, Eileen Collins, you know who her hero was? Amelia Earhart. When she was a little girl in Elmira, New York, she worked at Pudgy's Pizza to save money for her pilot's lessons. And she learned to be a glider pilot. She wrote a quote about this book for me. I got to meet her. She says, as a teenager, I wanted to be Amelia Earhart. I wanted to go where no one had been. I wanted to fly farther, faster, and higher. That's why it's so special to take one of Amelia's scarves on her first space flight in 1995. Someone loaned her one of Amelia's real scarves so that she could blast off with the shuttle with Amelia's Earhart scarf. And then she talks about reading the text of Light Flight sends chills up my spine. I sense the wind, taste the brisk air, feel the cold metal switches and gauges inside the cockpit. I can smell the aviation fuel, hearing the engine noise, seeing the tiny objects on the ground. I became better aware of the excitement Amelia felt as she flew her first solo flight across the Atlantic. I could also sense the anticipation during her flight, as well as her hard work and tough attitude leading up to a successful conclusion to her adventure. So here is a woman who was born many years after Amelia and so influenced by it. So I think there's a lot here for you to get out of the library. We have a few minutes left. There's more questions. Yes?
I have 2 questions. What, do you read adult books too?
I have done covers for over 2,000 books.
And some adults?
Yes.
Do you know about, like, say, tokens like Lord of the Rings?
J.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings.
Oh, sure, I know about
Yeah,
those.
I really like those books.
And they're very popular books, and I have friends who do covers for those books. I have done covers for historian David McCullough. I've done a lot of young adult fiction over the years, but I have literally done covers for 2,000 books in my career. And I still like doing them, except I really enjoy doing children's books. To me, it's a great honor to share my interest in science and nature and history of our country with the next generation. And I find that everything's a treasure hunt for me. And David McCullough, who is one of our great historians, is one of the people I admire most because he tells America's story in such a wonderful way. way in the back with a striped shirt.
When did you start drawing books?
I've been doing it for over 25 years now, and I've been, to show you how old I am, I've been illustrating for over 40 years. Right now, if you get a chance, the Norman Rockwell Museum up in Stockbridge has my exhibition of 25 years of picture book art. There are 150 original paintings from a lot of these books in that show. So if you want to take a field trip to the Norman Rockwell Museum before the end of May, you'll see a lot of the original paintings from my books. But I knew very early on, by the time I was in 4th grade, I had decided to be an artist. How I was going to do that, I had no idea. But I never let go of the dream. Yes.
Do you write chapter books?
I've been asked to, and I'm thinking about it. But, you know, considering the fact that I never thought in my wildest dreams I would write anything, I'm working up to it. You're never too late to start. But writing is something that I have come to slowly. Pictures come a lot easier for me. How many like to draw pictures? How many of you like to write? Not as many, you see? Writing is a little harder, I think. However, here's a little hint. The next time you think of a story, draw a bunch of pictures that you're seeing like a movie. It's like a movie layout. And then write to the pictures. That's how I do it. I think of pictures first and write to the pictures. They all go together. The picture and the written word are a different kind of language, but it's the same creative process. Yes?
What's your favorite children's book that you did?
That I didn't do? That I didn't do. You know who I admire a great deal is Chris Van Allsburg's Polar Express. And when I was a little kid, Beatrix Potter, the stories of Peter Rabbit. She's a wonderful artist. Her work has survived many, many years. I have so many friends who do this kind of work. My industry, the children's book authors and illustrators, we all know each other, and we all sort of admire each other's work. And there's room for everybody. Fantasy, science fiction. You know, Mary Grand Prix is the woman who illustrated all the Harry Potter books. I know her. Yep.
I like Harry Potter.
Yeah, a wonderful story. Anyway, yes, any more questions? Now, the thing about it is, the advice I'd like to leave for you today is, the more you read, the more places you're going to go. And I am one to tell you that reading was like pulling teeth for me when I was your age. I didn't like doing it. But eventually I began to realize, especially with Mr. Gilkey's help, that the words on the page actually are exciting. They create wonderful pictures in the mind. More exciting than going to the movie. Because they're your pictures, nobody else's. So if you can imagine reading a book like Call of the Wild or Red Badge of Courage, and think of the images that you're having in your mind, that's what I do before I draw pictures. And then I'll look around and say, you could be a model for my book, and I'll photograph you and paint you. How about that? All right. Anybody else? Yes?
Do you remember what was your first book?
The first book, picture book, was a book called Mojave, about the desert. And that was literally 25 years ago this year. And so I really had a good time there. What are you doing?
Taking over.
You're taking over. Oh, sure. Is it the report there? Oh, okay. Which one is it? Oh, there it is. Oh. We have this book?
I don't have it.
Oh, I don't know, yeah, I mean, I was just saying that one of my models went to school here. A lot of them did. Now, this is a catalog of my exhibition at the Rockwell, and I wrote a biography of my life, and I printed my first grade teacher's report card to my mother. It's from Miss Coddington after first grade. And she writes about me. This is me in first grade. We've been doing quite a bit of independent reading with Wendell, and he seems to be at a loss as to know how to do it. He is very dependent upon someone helping with new words. I think we'll be happy next year if he does daily reading with his summer, in the summer. 10 to 15 minutes a day would be fine. In this way, he could retain his reading vocabulary and gain a feeling of security. New words should be sounded out and connected to the old vocabulary. He, at the present time, seems not to understand this. So if you don't understand what I mean, feel free to call me. Now, this is where little Wendell was at first grade, at a loss about reading. And I printed it as an inspiration for all of you, that no matter how difficult you think you're having to learn to read, you can overcome it. Now, I had to go to special reading classes from first grade all the way through sixth grade. And in my day, if you were going to special reading classes, that was not something you were too proud of. And so I had to live with that sort of humility for all my school years, and always thinking that there was something that I didn't know. But I'm a dyslexic. There's now a new definition of dyslexia. We learn to think in different ways, and everybody thinks in a different way. So if you're not as fast as your schoolmates, don't worry about it. You're going to catch up, and someday you'll even pass them. Trust me, I know about this. Yes?
Did you know anybody named Walter Sorrells?
I don't believe so. Who's that?
He's an author.
Now, there are lots of authors, but that one I'm not familiar with. Yes, yeah, way back.
How did you start drawing? How did you start reading?
How did I start drawing? I couldn't help myself from drawing. That's all I ever wanted to do. But you know, when I graduated from high school, I didn't have enough money to go to college, so I had to work at various jobs that were, not what I wanted to do. And the more I realized what there are a lot of jobs in this world that you don't want to do, and the more I realized I needed to develop my talent. So I saved my money and went to art school. And the biggest event in my life was graduating from art school. I worked for Hallmark Cards. I drew fuzzy bunnies even a long time ago. And then I moved to New York. And with my portfolio, I sold my car, I had a suitcase, and I started knocking on doors. And sooner or later, I wound up doing book covers and then winding up writing and illustrating and making a lot of friends with authors that you all know and have heard of. It's to me a special privilege to be able to, as I say, share my interest with you in book form. And what's really fun is that when I do a book and it's printed in China or Japan or Korea, or I had two books printed in the Slovak language, France, Germany, you name it. The paintings I'm painting up on the hill in my studio in Washington are literally going around the world. And a book is a powerful thing. It sits silently on the shelf until you're ready to pick it up. Once you pick it up and start reading it, a whole world opens up to you. And everything you need to know is in a book, somewhere. Don't ever forget that. And Buzz Aldrin is a classic case where he wasn't a rocket pilot. He wasn't a jet fighter. He didn't fly experimental aircraft. But he knew one thing: if I go back to college and study aeronautics and astronautics at MIT, I will know more than the guys who fly these experimental aircraft. Buzz Aldrin's mathematical mind enabled us to go to the moon because he created the calculations that we needed to do rendezvous in space, that the lunar lander needed to do with the main command module to get to the moon. Now, there was a decision that education made all the difference in the world. Buzz Aldrin has to be thanked in more ways than one. He may not have been the first man to step foot on the moon, but without Buzz Aldrin's help, Neil Armstrong couldn't have done it either. Another story I love is the Wright brothers. They never finished high school. They figured out how to fly a heavier than air machine with a powered engine and a propeller that nobody else could figure out. They were bicycle mechanics. They were not formally educated. So education comes in many different forms. And so much of what you do in life is a passion for what you do. And so if you have something that you really love to do, that may be the answer of what you wind up doing for the rest of your life. I know it's true in my case. And it has been a great, one more question.
If you could pick one book in the whole world, what book would you pick?
Oh, boy. Probably the online encyclopedia, so I could have every piece of knowledge I could get my hands on. One of my favorite writers is Jack London, Mark Twain. I have so many. But I hope you enjoyed today, and study hard, read books, and listen to your teachers. They know what they're talking about. Thanks very much.
Thank you.